The letter arrived on a Tuesday in October, which was the worst possible day for it to arrive, because Tuesday was when she walked to the post office and back past the whole length of Dellard's Main Street, and half the town was always out by 10 in the morning doing their errands, and she was doing hers, and so there was no way to read the thing privately before her face decided what it thought. She read it on the post office steps anyway. The postmaster had handed it over without meeting her eyes, which told her he already knew what was inside, which meant his wife knew, which meant by supper the rest of Dellard would know too, and there was nothing to be done about that now. The letter was from her aunt in Cincinnati. It was 4 sentences long. Her aunt had let the house. Her aunt was sorry. Her aunt wished her well in her future arrangements. There were no future arrangements. She folded the letter along its original crease and put it in her coat pocket, and stood on the post office steps in the cold for a moment, with her chin level. The sky over Dellard was the color of old pewter. A wagon went by on the street below, the driver not looking at her, which was worse somehow than if he had. She had come to Dellard 8 months ago. She had come because her aunt had written that there was room for her, that her cousin's family was there, that there was work in a town still finding its shape. She had come because there was nowhere else to go after the thing that happened in Harrisburg, which she did not think about directly, but which had nonetheless determined every decision she had made in the 2 years since. She had been mending clothes out of a room above the dry goods store. The work was enough to pay for the room and not much else. The cousin's family had been kind in the beginning and then quietly less kind as the months moved on, the way families sometimes were when a person failed to resolve herself into something useful. She had not resolved. She had simply persisted, which was not the same thing. Now there was the letter, and there was the room she could not pay for past November, and there was the street below the post office steps with its ordinary Tuesday morning traffic of people who had places to be. She put her hand in her pocket and kept it there, her fingers flat against the folded paper. Down the street, a man came out of the hardware store carrying a length of iron pipe over one shoulder. He set it in the bed of a wagon, turned to go back inside, and stopped. He looked at her for a moment from across the street, not with curiosity exactly, with attention, the way a person looked at something they were deciding about. Then he went back inside. She walked home. The letter said his name was beside hers on the arrangement, that a reverend in Taller Creek would perform the ceremony upon her arrival, and that he was a widower with 2 children and a working ranch 12 miles east of town. It said he needed someone to manage the house. It did not say much else. She read it again that evening by the window while the sun went flat and orange over the rooftops. The room around her was small and honest in the way of rooms that charged what they could get. A washstand, a hook on the wall where her spare dress hung, a tin candle holder with a short candle she had been rationing since September. She folded the letter and put it under the washstand Bible and did not take it out again until morning. She did not know what a man like that looked like. She knew what the letter looked like, businesslike, spare, without ornament. She had written letters herself and knew that people wrote the way they were willing to be seen, which was never the whole of them. He had not written, "I would welcome you." He had written the arrangement would suit, and the children require managing, and the Reverend is available Fridays. She noted all of it. She thought about the room and what November would cost her. She thought about her cousin's wife, who had begun leaving only one plate on the table at supper, which was not a thing she had said anything about, only a thing that had happened and continued to happen. In the morning, she went back to the post office steps, which had become a place she thought of as hers now in the small way of a person with very few things. The town moved around her. A woman passed with a basket of linens. Two men unloaded something from the back of a wagon outside the land office. The air smelled of coal smoke and something faintly sweet from the bakery 2 doors down. Cinnamon or anise, she could not decide which. The man came out of the hardware store again. She did not look directly at him. She was not certain it was the same man until he stopped at the edge of the boardwalk and set down whatever he was carrying. And then she was certain, because he stood the same way. Not restless, not impatient, simply present in the way of a man who had decided to be somewhere and stayed decided. He did not look at her this time. He looked at the wagon. He adjusted something in the bed, checked the hitch, moved around to the other side. She watched him the way she had taught herself to watch things, without appearing to, without wanting anything from the watching, just collecting what was true. He climbed up to the seat, gathered the reins, and drove east out of town. She went inside and wrote her reply. She wrote the reply sitting at the small table near the window, the one that caught the last light of the afternoon. She used 3 sentences. She said she could cook and keep house. She said she understood the arrangement to be practical in nature. She said she would arrive on the Thursday train if he intended to send confirmation. She did not mention what she had seen on the boardwalk. She did not mention the way he had stood. That was not information that belonged in a letter. It was only information that belonged to her, collected without wanting anything from it, and she filed it in the place where she kept things that were simply true. The confirmation came 9 days later, a single line in handwriting that pressed hard into the paper. Thursday is fine. I'll meet you at the platform. No signature. She understood that, too. She gave notice at the boarding house the following morning. The woman who ran it, a practical widow with a good face, looked at her for a long moment before nodding. She did not offer congratulations. She offered a cloth bag she'd been meaning to give someone and a jar of preserved peaches she said would not last another week. It was the kindest send-off available, and both of them knew it. She packed in under an hour. She had done it before. The train west left at 6:15 in the morning. She found a seat on the left side so the light would be to her back, and she could watch the country opening up without squinting into it. For the first hour it was flat and unremarkable. Then the land started to shift. Something in the color of the grass, something in how far the sky went. She did not romanticize it. It was just country. But it was different country, and different was what she had written those 3 careful sentences to get. She ate the peaches at noon, working around the jar with 2 fingers, and when they were gone, she wrapped the empty jar in her extra shirtwaist to keep it from breaking and put it back in her bag. She did not know why she kept it. She kept it. The town appeared before she was ready for it. Not in the sense that she was afraid. She was not afraid. She had organized herself around this decision for 9 days, and it was settled. But the way a place looked when you first saw it was something you could not prepare for. And she let herself look at it plainly. A water tower, a grain elevator, a street of storefronts the color of pale dust, a platform with 3 people standing on it. He was the one standing apart. He was not watching the train. He was watching something beyond the track. A hawk, maybe, or nothing. When the brakes sounded, he turned, and she noticed he had taken off his hat before she stepped down. She stepped down onto the platform, and the ground was solid under her, and that was the first thing she registered. Solid ground after 9 days of motion. The second thing was the wind, which was constant here, a low, persistent thing that moved the dust in one direction and kept moving it. He walked toward her, not quickly. He covered the distance between them the way a man covers ground he has covered before, without looking at his feet, without hurrying, without the performance of hurrying. He was taller than she had imagined, or the platform was smaller. She could not tell which. He stopped 2 feet from her and looked at her directly. She looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment that was not quite uncomfortable. Then he said, "You made it." She said, "I did." He looked at the bag in her hand. He did not move to take it. She did not offer it. He said, "The wagon's at the livery. It's about a 1/4 mile." She said, "All right." They walked. She matched his pace without adjusting for it, which he seemed to notice, or she thought he noticed. She could not be certain what he noticed. The main street was quiet for mid-morning. A woman in front of the dry goods store watched them pass. A man outside the barber's watched them pass. She kept her chin level and her eyes forward and let herself be looked at, because there was no way around being looked at, and no point in wasting energy on what could not be changed. He said, "I have a boy. He's 6. She said, "You wrote that." He said, "He's quiet. He wasn't always." She did not ask what had changed him. She understood the shape of what he was saying. The livery was dim and smelled of hay and old leather and something underneath both of those things. He had a roan mare hitched to a flatbed wagon, and the wagon had a board seat with a folded blanket on it. She climbed up without assistance and settled the bag at her feet. He came around and unhitched the mare with the economy of someone who had done it 10,000 times. And then he climbed up on the other side and took the reins. They drove out of town without speaking. The country opened around them, flat first, then rising gently to the west where the hills were pale green, going gold at the edges. She looked at it. After a while, he said, "The kitchen's got a good stove. Whatever else you find fault with." She said, "I'll reserve judgment." Something shifted briefly in his face, gone before she could read it clearly. The wagon rolled on. The wind came across the open land steady and without interruption, and she felt it against the side of her face and thought, different country. She had gotten that much at least. The ranch sat at the end of a road that was more suggestion than fact. 2 ruts through dry grass, and then a gate made of poles lashed with wire, and then a yard. She took it in without expression. A house, low and long, with a covered porch running the full front length. A barn behind it, newer than the house by the look of the wood. A kitchen garden to the south side, fenced against rabbits, with the remnants of last season's growth still in the ground. Dried stalks, unpulled. Someone had started it and stopped. He drove the wagon around to the barn, and she climbed down before he came around. He watched her do it and said nothing. Inside, the house was clean in the way that suggested effort rather than habit. Someone had swept recently. The surfaces were bare. There were 2 chairs at the kitchen table and a third against the wall at an angle that suggested it had been moved there and left. She registered all of it without comment. The stove was good. She could see that immediately. A broad iron range with 4 burners and a warming shelf above, and a wood box beside it that was 3/4 full. She rested one hand briefly on the surface of the range, still faintly warm from the morning. He came in behind her and set her bag inside the door. The boy was at the table. He had been there the whole time, she realized, sitting very still in the way children sit when they are trying not to be noticed. 7 or 8 years old, she guessed. Pale hair. His father's careful eyes, though his were not careful yet in the same way. They still showed too much. She looked at him directly. He looked back. She said, "What's your name?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at his father, who was standing at the far end of the kitchen with one hand resting on the back of a chair. His father said, "You can answer." He said his name. She said, "I'll need to know where things are kept." He slid off the chair and stood. He was small for what she had guessed his age to be. He crossed the kitchen and opened the cabinet to the left of the stove and showed her without speaking. Flour, salt, baking powder, a tin of lard. He opened a second door, dried beans, a small crock of something sealed with wax, a paper-wrapped parcel she assumed was sugar. He stood back. She said, "Thank you." He nodded once and returned to his chair. She turned to look at the kitchen properly then, measuring it the way she measured most things, with patience and without conclusion. There was work to do here, considerable work, beyond the cooking. But the stove was good. She had said she would reserve judgment, and she had meant it. The boy was watching her from the table, and she let him watch. She started with the stove, not because it was first on any list, but because it was the thing she could assess quickly, and everything else depended on it. She opened the firebox, checked the grate, ran her thumb along the damper handle to see how it moved. It was a good stove. Someone had maintained it, or at least not ruined it. She added 2 pieces of wood from the box beside the wall and adjusted the damper until the draw was right. The boy watched her do this without comment. She filled the largest pot from the bucket near the door and set it to heat. Then she went through the cabinets again, more slowly this time, making a proper accounting. There was enough. Not abundance, enough. Someone had been buying provisions without much system, which meant some things were doubled and others were missing entirely. There was lard, but no vinegar. There were dried beans enough for a month, but only a heel of salt pork to flavor them. She found, behind a sack of cornmeal, 3 jars of put-up tomatoes with tight lids and good color. She set them on the counter in a line. She did not know who had put them up. She did not ask. She started with beans and cornbread because it was what the provisions allowed, and because there was nothing performative about it. It was supper, not a demonstration. The beans had been soaked, she discovered. Someone had set them in water, she didn't know when, but they had softened enough. She put them on with the pork and the tomatoes and let them find their pace. The cornbread she mixed by hand, measuring by feel the way she had learned before she was old enough to read a receipt card. The boy had not moved from his chair, but he had shifted so he could see her more directly. She didn't look at him. She worked. The man came back through once, briefly, to refill the water bucket without speaking. He set it by the door where the other had been. She said, "The kindling box is near empty." He paused. He said, "I'll cut more in the morning." She said nothing further, and he left. The boy watched the door close behind his father. She slid the cornbread into the oven and wiped her hands on her apron. Her own apron, brought in her bag, already tied on, which the boy had noticed. She could tell he had noticed because he had looked at it twice without looking at her face. She found 2 lanterns. One had oil, one didn't. She filled the second from a tin in the cabinet beneath the window and lit them both against the fading light. By the time the beans were ready, the kitchen was warm and the windows had gone dark, and the 3 of them sat down at the table together for the first time. Nobody said it was a beginning. The beans were plain and the cornbread was not sweet. Neither of them said anything about that. The boy ate without lifting his eyes from the bowl, not shyly. He had the manner of a child who had learned that looking too directly at something good might cause it to leave. He ate steadily, methodically, the way children eat when they are genuinely hungry and have been for a while. She noticed the way he held his spoon. She noticed, too, that the man ate without comment, which she took as neither rejection nor approval. He cleaned his bowl. He broke the cornbread the way a man does when he has not had bread in some days. Carefully, not wastefully. He did not ask for more, but he did not push the plate away either. And when she set the remaining cornbread on the table between them, he took another piece after a pause that was barely a pause at all. The fire in the stove settled. Outside, the wind had come up. Not hard, just enough to press against the glass and remind the room that there was an outside. She refilled the boy's bowl without asking. He looked up then, briefly, and she had already looked away. When they were finished, she cleared the table and the man stood and said he would see to the horses. She said nothing. He took his coat from the peg by the door and went. The boy remained at the table, watching her move to the basin with the bowls. She filled it with water from the bucket. Hot water from the kettle, cold from the bucket, working it to the right temperature by feel. The boy said, "He doesn't usually eat that much." She kept washing. She said, "Is that so?" He said, "Usually it's just salt pork, or nothing." She set a bowl on the drying cloth and reached for the next one. He said, "I know how to make salt pork." She said, "That's useful to know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know how to make beans like that." She said, "I'll show you sometime if you want." He didn't answer, but she heard the small shift of his weight on the chair. Not away, toward. She finished the bowls and dried her hands. The lantern on the table had burned down a little, and she adjusted the wick and it brightened again. The room looked different in the steadier light. Not warm exactly, but less bare. The boy said he was up last night, walking around. She folded the drying cloth and set it over the basin. She said, "Do you sleep all right?" He shrugged with one shoulder. She looked at him then, properly, for the first time that evening. He let her. The fire in the stove ticked once, and the wind pressed the window again. And somewhere past the barn, the man was moving in the dark, doing what needed doing. She asked the boy what time he'd heard it. He thought about it. Said, after the fire went down. So late then, past midnight. She didn't ask what the man had been doing or where he'd walked. She asked if it had scared him. The boy looked at the table. Said, "Not scared, just awake." She nodded. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Not to talk, exactly. just to be in the room with him while he worked through whatever he was working through. He had a small stone in his hand, smooth and gray, the kind a boy picks up from a creek bed for no reason and carries for weeks. He turned it over with his thumb. She waited. He said, "He does it more when the weather changes." She said, "Some people do." He said, "Did someone die?" She said, "I think so. A long time before you." He turned the stone over again. The fire in the stove had gone quieter. Outside, the wind moved through the gap under the door, and she made a note to herself about the gap, what she'd need to fix it. He said, "My mother." She said, "Yes." He didn't cry. He just kept turning the stone. She watched his hands and thought he had his father's hands already. The same proportion of thumb to finger, the same way of holding a thing steadily without squeezing. She said, "Do you remember her?" He shook his head, then stopped. Said, "I remember her smell, like something warm." She said, "That's something worth having." He looked up at her then. She held his gaze without making anything of it. After a while, he said, "Are you going to stay?" She said, "I don't know yet." He nodded like that was a reasonable answer, like he had expected something honest and she had given it to him, and now they could both sit with it. She respected him for that. He was young enough that people probably still tried to protect him from honest answers, and he had figured out that the protection was the worst thing. The door opened. The man came in from the dark, stamping his boots on the board outside before crossing the threshold. He brought cold air with him and the smell of the barn. He saw them sitting at the table and he stopped for a moment. Just a moment. She said, "There's still some coffee if you want it." He said, "All right." He moved to the stove and poured what was left into his cup and stood there with his back to them for longer than was necessary for a man who was only drinking coffee. The boy had closed his hand around the stone. She didn't look away from the stove. She didn't look toward it either. She just sat in the chair and listened to the wind and to the small sounds a house makes when the people inside it are deciding, without saying so, whether they are going to let it hold them. He finished the coffee standing up. He rinsed the cup at the basin and set it on the counter the way he always did. Rim down, handle turned to the left. And then he said goodnight to the boy without looking at her, and goodnight to her without looking at either of them. And he went to his room and closed the door. Not hard, just closed. The boy sat for another minute. She could feel him working something out, the way children do when they are trying to fit a large thing into a small container. Then he put the stone in his shirt pocket and stood up and said he was going to bed. She said, "All right." She meant it. He padded across the floor in his socked feet and disappeared down the hall. She stayed at the table. The wind had picked up since supper, and it came under the door in thin, cold lines that moved along the floor and found her ankles. She should have gone to bed. She knew she should. The candle was burning down, and there was no reason to sit in a cooling kitchen alone, and she was tired in the way that comes from more than work. But she stayed. There was a loose nail head in the table. She'd noticed it weeks ago. It sat just to the left of center, barely raised above the wood, something a thumb could find in the dark. She pressed her thumb against it now, just held it there. The slight edge of it, not enough to hurt. She was not unhappy. That was the thing she kept arriving at and not quite trusting. She had come here because she had nowhere else to go, and she had stayed because leaving would have meant something she wasn't ready to name. But sitting here now in the cold and the quiet, she could not honestly say she was unhappy. There was something in this house that held, something she had not expected when she stepped off that train with a single bag and a letter she had read too many times. She had expected to be useful. She had not expected to matter. The difference was not something she could have explained to anyone who asked, and no one was going to ask. But it was there. She felt it in the way the boy had closed his hand around the stone. She felt it in the way the man had stood at the stove longer than was necessary. She pressed her thumb against the nail head once more, and then stood up. She blew out the candle. In the dark, she found the edge of the counter, and then the doorway, and then the hall, and she went to bed in the room that had become, without ceremony or announcement, hers. The next morning the boy came down to breakfast already dressed, which had not happened before. She noticed it the way she noticed most things in this house, without comment, filing it somewhere quiet. He sat in his chair and waited, which was also new. Normally he appeared in stages, one boot, then the other, a yawn stretched long enough to crack the silence. She set a plate in front of him, and he said thank you with the particular formality of a child who has decided to try something. She turned back to the stove. The man came in from outside with cold still on his coat. He hung it on the peg. He looked at the boy dressed and at the plate already half-eaten, and something moved briefly across his face before he sat down. She poured his coffee and set it on the table and went back to her work. The three of them ate without much talking, which was ordinary. But the silence had a different quality to it that morning, less like distance and more like the silence of people who have been in a room together, long enough that quiet no longer requires explanation. After, when the boy had gone to pull his boots on properly and clatter out to the porch, the man remained at the table. She was washing the tin plates, her back to him, and she heard the particular stillness of someone who has something to say and has not yet decided to say it. She kept washing. He said finally that the Harmon boy had told him in town that the school teacher's position was still open through spring, that Mrs. Harmon had mentioned she heard they were looking again. She didn't turn around. He said it wasn't his business to say one way or the other. She set a plate on the edge to dry. She said she had heard the same. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the boy had started sleeping through the night most nights. He said it almost to the table. She turned then. He was looking at his cup. His hands were around it, not quite holding, just resting. She said she had noticed. He nodded once, the way he nodded when something had been decided without requiring words. She dried her hands on the cloth and folded it over the rod above the basin. Outside, she could hear the boy on the porch steps, testing the boards with his heel, finding the one that still gave slightly, the one that hadn't been fixed yet, the one she had told herself she would look at when the weather held. The man pushed back from the table and picked up his coat. He paused at the door with his hand on the frame. He said he'd be back by midday. She said she knew. He left. The door settled closed behind him. She spent the morning in the usual way. The dishes put away, the floor swept, the ashes pulled from the firebox and the new wood laid in and left to catch. She moved through the rooms with the kind of attention that had become second nature. Checking what needed checking, leaving what did not, keeping the domestic machinery of the place running without noise or announcement. The boy came inside around mid-morning, his boots leaving a thin trace of red dust across the clean boards. She looked at the dust. She looked at him. He looked at his boots. He went back to the door and knocked them together on the step and came back in. And she did not say anything, and he did not either. He sat at the table with the small piece of wood he had been working at, a knife in his hand, trying to find the shape in it that he seemed to believe was there. She watched him for a moment from the doorway. He had his father's hands, the same economy of motion, nothing wasted. She went to the porch. The loose board was the third from the bottom. She knew it by sound, the give of it, the soft creak that was slightly different from the other boards, a note just lower than the rest. She pressed it with her heel the way the boy had done. It settled and rose again. She knelt down and ran her hand along the edge. The nail had pulled from the joist. Not damaged, just loose. She could see the gap. She went to the small lean-to at the side of the house where he kept the tools. She found what she needed without looking for long. He kept things in order. Everything returned to where it had come from. Everything positioned so it could be found again. She had noticed that about him early, the care in it, the quiet intention that spoke to a man who had learned, at some point, that losing track of things had a cost. She came back with the hammer and a new nail and knelt on the bottom step. It did not take long. 3 strikes, maybe 4. She tested the board with her palm and then her weight. It held. She sat back on the step for a moment with the hammer across her knees. The air was still. Down past the last building, the road dissolved into pale grass and then open country, and the sky above it was the color of something not quite decided. She could hear the boy inside, the scrape of his knife against the wood. She set the hammer beside her on the step. After a moment, she picked it up and went back to the lean-to and placed it where she had found it. She did not tell him when he came back at midday. He noticed it 3 days later. She was at the table mending a shirt when she heard him stop on the bottom step. A pause, then his weight shifting, testing the board. She kept her eyes on the needle. He came inside and set his hat on the hook. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter with the cup in both hands. He did not say anything. She pulled the thread through and smoothed the collar flat. "Board on the step," he said finally. A silence. "When did you do that?" "A few days ago." She turned the shirt and found the next loose seam. The nail was just proud. Didn't take long. He set the cup down. She could feel him looking at her, though she did not look up to confirm it. After a moment, he picked the cup back up. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once and kept sewing. That evening after supper, the boy fell asleep at the table with his cheek on his arm and his carving still in his hand. A rough shape that might have been a horse, or might have been something else entirely, but which he handled with the seriousness of a thing that mattered. She lifted him and carried him to his cot and tucked the blanket around his shoulders. He did not wake. When she came back to the main room, he was still at the table. He had not moved to the porch, which was where he usually went in the evenings. She sat down across from him. She did not have her mending. They had not left the lamp burning, and the last of the light came through the west window at a low angle, going amber and then not. After a while, he said, "I thought you'd be gone by spring." She looked at the window. "I know. I wasn't—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't make it easy." "No," she agreed. He turned the cup in his hands, set it down. "It's a hard place," he said. "Winters, the work. I know what it is." He nodded slowly. Something moved through his face and then was still. Outside, the last light left the window. The room went quiet and dark in the way of places that have learned to be quiet, that have had enough noise and do not reach for more. He did not say what he might have said. She did not say what she might have said. After a long moment, she rose and lit the lamp. The flame caught small and then steadied. She set it on the counter between them. He watched her sit back down. Neither of them moved to end the evening. The candle on the sill burned the way it had burned every night since the first frost, low and steady, and without any particular hurry.